Alexander Fury. Welcome to Fashion Forensics.
Thank you for having me.
A fashion historian, archivist, you've devoted your life to understanding fashion through multiple lenses and understanding the designers and people that make the industry. You've also served and still serving as the fashion director at another magazine, previously worked at SHOWstudio, Love magazine, worked with one of the greatest photographers and artists and designers. And recently you've curated some of the biggest fashion exhibitions, mostly with things from your own archives. So I'm very curious to first ask you, how would you describe yourself?
I always used to say that my job was looking at dresses and writing nasty things about them, which I still think to a degree is true. But I guess what I always do and have done is analyze fashion. So whether that's through writing, which is kind of the traditional route that I've been following, or now through kind of imagery curation, I think it's always kind of having this sort of analytical approach to fashion. And I love fashion. I think that's also a big part of what I do, and not enough people who work in fashion actually really love fashion. But I do, and I think that's the real core of what I'm doing, is kind of celebrating fashion, analyzing fashion, enjoying fashion, and then trying to communicate that to other people.
You grew up in a very different household. Your parents were not creatives.
No.
And how was that for you? Do you remember your very first visual memory in your life that really struck you?
The first memory is one of the images that I've chosen for this, which is this picture of Carla Bruni in a Galliano dress from autumn-winter 1995. And yeah, you're right. I didn't grow up in a kind of fashion household. My mum always used to buy a lot of clothes, but they weren't particularly good clothes. They were kind of fashionable, but they weren't high fashion. And she had fashion magazines, but not kind of Vogue, Elle, Harper's, anything like that. She would buy more what I think people kind of disparagingly refer to then and possibly now as women's interest magazines. So more kind of Cosmopolitan, New Woman, and Marie Claire. But Marie Claire in the 90s in Britain was actually quite sort of fashion conscious. And that, if my memory serves me correctly, and if there's one thing I have, it's a kind of Rain Man memory of fashion, is this image was in an old issue of Marie Claire magazine. And I remember seeing it and not really kind of understanding what was going on, because I knew what fashion shows looked like, and fashion shows, had white backdrops and had a designer's name written on the white backdrop, and the models walked up and down. But then this image of Carla Bruni, she's on rooftops in Spain, it's supposed to be in Spain, and it's snowing, and she's wearing this kind of extraordinary dress, and it didn't kind of conform to those fashion images that I knew, that I'd already become familiar with. So it did become something that I became kind of fascinated by, and that was sort of my gateway into kind of the world of Galliano, which I think for me, I didn't grow up in London. I grew up in the countryside outside of Manchester, so really in the middle of nowhere, and completely kind of isolated from fashion. And no one else I knew was interested in fashion, boys or girls. So when I kind of saw that image and then started to kind of discover the work that John was doing, particularly with Amanda Harlock at that point in time, it was kind of like finding this bunch of other people that saw the world the same way that I did. And I think it's weird to talk about now, because I think it's so different for generations following me. The internet has made everything so different in that you can, no matter what your kind of deranged interests are, you can find someone else across the world that kind of shares that interest and have some kind of kinship with them, and not feel like it's just you by yourself.
You kind of have this community of people available at all times of the day.
Yeah, exactly.
How did you come across this community as a teenager? I can imagine it really was as you said, it was a very different time. What made you start researching into fashion, and how was the whole process of diving into the history books?
It wasn't actually a community thing. It was always me by myself. It was yes, very lonely. But I was very lucky that the town that I grew up in had a library which, to my mind, and still to my mind, had a very good fashion section, which was kind of bizarre for a weird sort of northern town. It had a really good selection of fashion books, very strange fashion books, a lot of which I have subsequently purchased for myself because there were these kind of weird things that sort of became my Bible. And I got banned from taking a lot of them out of the library because I used to take them out and renew them over and over again. And I got a letter saying that I was like defeating the object of a lending library by, keeping a book out for 3 years. But, I'm really, from discovering the work of Galliano and Vivienne Westwood and McQueen, because they were all fascinated with history and constantly referencing history, when you're kind of young and curious and hero worshipping these people, if they are talking about, kind of 19th century bustles or Charles James or, McQueen talking about kind of 14th century cutting methodologies for coats, that you go off and you look at that stuff. You go off and you explore those avenues. So I was very lucky that the work at that point of contemporary designers was so obsessed with history that it then sent you down this kind of rabbit hole of
studying the history
of studying
behind
the
it.
history, exactly, of finding out the kind of origins of the inspirations, where their clothes come from. And then also there's I would say those three were the first because they were British and because they were the people that the newspapers were writing about. That was a point when fashion became front page news because Galliano was going to Dior and McQueen was going to Givenchy. That, it became kind of national news in a way fashion normally wasn't in the UK. But then off the back of that, I discovered people like Christian Lacroix, people like Azzedine Alaïa, people who were also equally as important to me in terms of kind of developing my kind of approach to fashion. And again, they're people that are referencing history, that are obsessed with history, people that love fashion. I think when you look at the people that I'm obsessed with, there's a very clear line. You can see it's not about minimalism. It's not about modernism. It's not about ready to wear. It's this kind of fashion as fantasy. I always say it's about kind of extremes, and that's what I'm attracted to. So whether that's kind of extremes of fantasy or extremes of sexuality or extremes of construction, I think you see that in all of their clothes, and that's really what I kind of fell in love with. And it ended up researching what was happening now and what was happening in the past, and discovering this kind of whole universe.
It's quite interesting you mention the added layers of history within those designers because I think the images that you selected when I asked you, these 5 images, are really representative of how you always take the past and your obsession with history into your work nowadays. And I want to talk to you about the very first image you actually talked to me about, which was the Carla Bruni for Galliano, Autumn Winter 96. When you first saw that image, which, Galliano's, this specific collection is very much talked about nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
What were those feelings towards Galliano when you first learned about him?
Well, because there was such a kind of buzz around Galliano at that point in time, there were kind of newspaper and magazine articles. I started buying Vogue in 1996, so that's when I started to kind of have, and I actually remember the first issue of Vogue that I bought. They used to have a section at the front called Diary, and basically it had this, for some reason for that particular one, the article was about designer inspirations, and it literally had kind of Galliano's favorite book, favorite film, and the same with McQueen, which was great for me because it meant I could go off and kind of get those books and watch those films, except McQueen's favorite film was like Pasolini's Salò. And I remember very innocently saying to my mum, like, this is McQueen's favorite film, I need to watch it. And she was like, absolutely not. Like, you're not watching that. You're not reading 120 Days of Sodom. But, so it was lucky that there was a lot of kind of material around this. So as soon as I saw this dress and fell in love with it, then there was kind of this way that you could sort of search things out. But it was, without the internet and things, it was difficult to to find anything. I remember, all of a sudden you'd start to see fashion images in newspapers. And that's how I knew when Fashion Week was. I didn't know otherwise. And
Yeah.
then it became that I would buy 5 newspapers a day because they might have coverage of the fashion shows. And I remember I used to get really pissed off if 2 newspapers had the same picture of the same outfit, because those were the only things that you were going to see for 6 months. It was a very different rhythm of consuming fashion imagery. But because it was news as well, there were kind of documentaries being made about designers, and there was in end of 96, start of 97, the South Bank show did a documentary about Galliano, and it was as he moved to Dior, but it was actually charting his first year at Givenchy, which obviously they didn't know was then going to become Dior. And I recorded that and I watched it every day, to the point where it kind of reemerged on YouTube recently, but it was dubbed in Portuguese, but I could still say every word from it.
You remembered the script.
Because I watched it every day. There's a bunch of things, and that was, whenever there was anything on TV about fashion, I would record it on VHS, and then I would just watch them endlessly, because you didn't have. It's very different today, where I think it's much easier to consume a lot of information, and especially fashion information. Then it was a much more kind of cloistered environment, and I think maybe that was what kind of bred a fascination, and then also what meant that you went and looked at kind of the history, because that was something that was kind of accessible to you.
Yeah. And did you feel like, because of those creatives, they really, I think they propelled a new generation of people to want to feel like fashion is something that reachable and something they can work in. Like, as you said, Vivienne, Westwood, McQueen, John Galliano. Did fashion feel something feasible for you then as a career? Did you start thinking about it in that way?
I mean, I was very kind of gung-ho that, I got the prospectus. I decided I wanted to go to St. Martin's when I was 12, and I got the prospectus when I was 13. And I
Fierce determination.
and was like, I'm gonna go. And at that point, I actually wanted to be a designer. Although later on, I realized I wanted to be John Galliano, and that wasn't going to happen. So but that was actually a very big reckoning when I was 18, 19, to realize this thing that I'd wanted since I was 12 actually wasn't what I could do. And it was probably a really good thing to actually think you were going to do this thing and then realize actually I can't. But it did. I was a little bit kind of stranded for a couple of years because I didn't really know what I could do and how to then get into the industry. But there was a kind of sense that there wasn't really anything else I could do. This was what I was obsessed with, and also I'd kind of turned down a lot of opportunities because this was what I wanted to do, and so I didn't go to kind of Oxford or Cambridge. I didn't study anything else. I'd gone to do an art foundation with the idea that then I would go and do study design at St. Martin's, and then after I did the foundation, I realized this isn't what I want to do. This isn't what I can do. It wasn't even that I didn't want to do it. It was like, I physically cannot do this. It's not something that is possible for me.
I mean,
I wasn't good enough. But that, that's the other thing. I'm also insanely competitive, and I don't do anything if I don't think I'm going to be the best at it.
You ended up studying fashion history and theory in the end. And do you still remember that moment where it was kind of the light bulb switch went off in your head and you're like, I know exactly what my next step would be? Did that moment ever come, or did you kind of fall into being on the editing / magazine / media side of things?
No, when I went to St. Martin's, I knew that I wanted to be a fashion journalist. It was always something that had kind of been in the back of my head. Even when I wanted to be a designer, it was very much that writing was the thing that came naturally to me. So I really wanted to be a designer, but a journalist was way more kind of a much more natural path for me, and something that I was much more kind of naturally attuned to. I think, I really tried to design. I really tried to be able to make clothes and all that kind of stuff, whereas writing was something I didn't even have to think about. It was so kind of easy. Not so much anymore, but then it was something that was super natural, super easy. And then I'd always had this fascination with history. So when I saw that there was the fashion history and theory course, which at that point was only 3 years old. So literally they'd had their first graduates just leave. I entered in the 4th year of the course's existence.
That must have felt really interesting because you're kind of, you don't know what you're getting into, and all of a sudden you know exactly what you want to do at the same time.
Well, there just weren't any courses like that. I'd never read about any courses. So when I read about it, I was like, oh, this is perfect. And it's so attuned to my interests. But then literally I went and did the interview. And when they were interviewing me, they were like, we think you already know too much to come and do this. We think you're going to be frustrated because you already know so much about the subject. You've already done, essentially, you've learned what we're going to teach you in the first year already. You know it. And then the first year I was horrendous and I didn't turn up to class, and they were actually right. But then the thing that was actually interesting about that course was it did open me up and make me think maybe there are other, like maybe I do want to go and do curation. Maybe I would like to work in a museum. So it actually made me kind of question a lot of things, just because it gave you lots of different opportunities to explore different kind of areas around this. And people who've also graduated from the course have gone on to kind of curatorial backgrounds. They've gone on to set up archives at fashion houses, to work at auction houses. And some have gone into journalism. But yeah, I was pretty kind of determined that this was what I wanted to do, that I wanted to pursue journalism after I left. And I'm pretty sort of bloody minded when I decide that there's something I want to do. It's like, this is what I'm going to do, unless I have a personal realization of I can't do this. I think it's something that I will try and pursue.
And do you remember the very first job or the very first step after you graduated? What was it?
After I graduated, I still had a kind of lingering sense of that maybe I wanted to do fashion design. So I went and worked with a fashion designer called Marius Schwab, who is now based in Athens, but then was London and was very much the kind of generation of Christopher Kane. There was kind of Gareth Pugh, Christopher Kane, Marius. And I worked with him for a season, and again realized kind of I don't have the sort of drive that it takes for you to be a designer. I always remember, and I've said this before, that at one point Marius went outside for a cigarette and was like, "Oh, this is the first time I've left the studio in 2 months," because he lived and worked in the same space.
Wow.
And I was just like, I don't have that. I don't have that kind of conviction about how I want the world to look. But then what I did do with Marius is I did a lot of research.
Sharpening those skills, the journalistic skills of you.
Well, yeah, it was enjoyable. And also I was quite precocious. He was, talking about inspirations. And I had a load of old British Vogues, like 80s, 90s British Vogues. And I just brought some in as if I was casually reading a British Vogue from 1992 with someone covered in pearls on the cover, because he'd been talking about pearls. And I think I even said, "Oh, I thought this might be interesting for you." And then he asked me to go off and do research, and then liked what I did. So then I got kind of sent off to do a lot of the research around the collection. And it was an amazing experience. And it is something that I still kind of do now when I work with designers, which is to try and help, guide people down certain kind of research routes or something like that, without any of the responsibility of actually seeing the eventual design through. And then after that, I think I talked to him about what I saw myself doing, and he said, "Oh, my friend Penny Martin works at SHOWstudio." Penny Martin at that point was the editor-in-chief at SHOWstudio, and he was like, "I think you would be a really good fit, and you should go and see about interning there." And I got in touch with them, and they said they wanted me to intern, and then I actually as I came, someone left really unexpectedly, and essentially there was I was very lucky that there was a vacuum, that they needed somebody who literally could answer the phone and kind of deal with the everyday sort of running of the studio. And I think I worked there for about a week, and it was very much self-guided because the people weren't there to look after me, and they were sort of like, "Okay, you'll do." And so I had a contract for 3 months, and I stayed for 5 years.
I mean, your work with Nick Knight has been such a huge part of your life and your career. And this brings me to the second image you chose, which was Kate Moss and Lanvin for the SS 2008 V Magazine editorial. So why did you choose that image?
I chose that image because that's the first ever fashion shoot I went on. And whenever I talk to other people, people talk about kind of assisting on shoots and maybe working on, this or that, or they do a shoot with a friend or something. And I'm always like, no, my first shoot was Nick Knight shooting Kate Moss for V Magazine in a on a sound stage in West London. And it was Sam McKnight doing the hair and Val Garland doing the makeup, and they were playing the Kinks, and there was a wind machine, and it was like every sort of cliched fashion shoot you've ever seen. And I'm always like, yeah, I was really spoiled that, when it comes to like shoots 1 out of 10, I started at like a 15. It was really in
Yeah.
at the deep
You
end.
started with the heavy hitters.
Yeah, but it was an amazing shoot as well, because I remember I chose that image particularly because Nick was shooting on 8x10 Polaroids, which people don't really do anymore. So these, and you shoot, so there was this amazing thing of the assistants kind of loading the Polaroids in and pulling them out, because there are these big plates, and each plate only does one Polaroid, each kind of tray. So pulling them out and then pinning the Polaroids up. And I always remember kind of looking at the Polaroids and Nick coming over to me and being like, "Oh, what do you think?" And I was like, why do you care what I think? But I was sort of like, oh, her face looks amazing here, and the hair's great here, and the dress looks great here, and she looks really Kate Moss here. And then Nick going, yeah, I'm taking the head off that, the dress off that, the legs off that. And it's such a kind of graphic dress. When you kind of look at the image and know that, you can kind of maybe see where the head has been cut off and transposed from a different one. But it was, the first time that I'd worked with a photographer, and obviously Nick works in such a specific way. But it was very interesting, because that was also a kind of multi-sensory 360 SHOWstudio-y project that was, they ended up having kind of a poet laureate on set, and people had sent flowers in that were scanned and used as part of the project, and then Kate was being turned into these massive flowers, and it was very sort of, it was a really kind of special because it was the first, but also I think Nick still does shoots that aren't like anybody else's, because he wants to show that process, and he wants to have lots of people involved, and he is interested in lots of people's opinions.
I think the most brilliant thing, when I also worked with him, was he became such a great mentor to me at my time there, because I could see the boundless creativity that he wasn't interested in whether somebody is big or small. He was interested in what you had to say and the kind of soul of work that you have to produce.
Yeah.
And I was always in awe of him being able to combine young designers and young artists and people who are still in university with these professionals and people that have been in 20 or 30 years in the industry. And I think the way he would see in his brain an editorial, and as you said, cut it up, change it, splice it, distort it. I really think that there's nobody like him right now that's still to this day that works in such a creative way. Do you remember the feeling after that first photo shoot where you participated into that Kate Moss shoot? How did you feel going off of that?
I just remember it feeling kind of very, very rewarding that you were in an environment where people wanted to, pay attention to what you were saying. And that it wasn't hierarchical. And like you said, it wasn't a case that you didn't feel like your opinion mattered. Like Nick actually asked for your opinion. I think, he was interested in hearing different people's points of view. And also, I knew a lot about fashion, and I was talking a lot about fashion, and Nick's always interested, I think, in people that know a lot about any particular subject. He likes talking to people. He's interested in hearing other people's opinions. And so I was kind of blathering away about stuff, and, and there was something there that was, it felt very much like you were encouraged to be kind of part of the conversation and not be kind of excluded from it. And that obviously isn't a universal thing about, I've worked with other photographers, I've worked on other shoots that have been very different, but I think it was, it's a sign of kind of Nick's confidence that he is interested in this kind of plurality of opinion. And it does actually affect him. The other thing I always think is really interesting with Nick is that, you might look at 6 pictures and everyone will think one is the most beautiful, and that's probably not the one Nick's going to choose. He's way more interested in a kind of unusual idea of beauty and something that's kind of different or extraordinary or unexpected. And he wants to kind of push that and discover something that people haven't seen before. And that's something that I really became, I worked with him for 5 years. And I became very used to the fact that Nick's going to choose the thing you think he would never choose is what he's going to choose. And, that you can never really predict him or his, what he will do, how he'll manipulate an image, what kind of vision he's got coming from it. And also that he's never really satisfied. He always wants to push,
and experiment more and
he'll
try
also
more.
work with something right up until the deadline, and then beyond the deadline, and then it's if he could have a little bit longer, then he would push it a bit more and try and do something else. But it was incredibly inspiring to work with someone like that. Also someone who's so open to so many different ideas and open to kind of being challenged by other people. He wants to challenge people. He always wants to try and do something new and different. It was really an amazing kind of experience, and we did some incredible things and some things that I'm kind of incredibly proud of and kind of can't believe we got to do.
I mean, one of my first touch points with fashion as a teenager, when I decided to pursue this, was in 2012. I watched the live SHOWstudio interview you did with Gaga.
Oh yeah,
which was, that was in the era where like the internet was this big boom, but we hadn't really figured out how we can use it.
Yeah.
And what SHOWstudio was doing was you guys were really doing something very creative and innovative, and especially that was such a great time for pop culture to meet underground fashion subcultures, and especially in London. And I just found the way everything was produced so experimental. And I can only imagine that for you as the journalist who has to have the responsibility of that, it was something. Was it nerve-wracking, or how was it for you?
I mean, you're talking about this and I'm getting like PTSD thinking about it, because I just remember when McQueen did Plato's Atlantis, just getting text messages being like, the live stream has crashed, so can you tweet a lot? Like, can you tweet a lot of pictures because the live stream has crashed? And I'm like, I don't think me tweeting is going to make up for
the genius, the brilliance of the visuals.
But also the fact that everyone wants to hear this Lady Gaga song and see this collection live. And I don't think me tweeting still pictures from the show is going to make up for that. But yeah, I always remember that happening. And it's, that's the thing. It was very unpredictable. It was, you didn't really know. There was, again, with Penny, one day we ended up, Nick was doing a project called Fashion DJs. It was a fashion radio station. And then on the day of it, Nick was like, oh, I actually think we need someone to present it. So I think you two should present it. Like 3 days of live radio with no preparation whatsoever. And I think we had to talk for like 12 hours each day, and luckily there was 2 of us. I think he'd asked Penny to do it, and Penny's like, I need somebody else to talk to, so Alex needs to do this with me. And so it was us kind of blathering away to sort of fill the silences, and us, it was very, very, it was crazy, some of the stuff that we did. But again, it's really amazing because of the curiosity and trying to push and genuinely do new things. I even remember one of the last projects I did with Nick, and I debated putting an image from this into this, was because I have one on my wall in my house.
Was it the next image we're going to talk about, the Gautier Couture?
No, but I do have those in my house. One of the last projects I did at SHOWstudio was Nick had discovered this new thing called Instagram that I was convinced wasn't going to catch on, and Nick was really obsessed with taking pictures of it, and I was so dismissive of it. Like, yeah, this is one of your weird little playthings. Like, sure, yeah. And then Nick had kind of researched into what people liked at that point on Instagram, which was super early, like within the first 2 years of it existing, I think. And it was like, oh, people like pictures of baby animals, and people like pictures of nails, like fingernails. So he got the nail technician Marion Newman to work on a project with him. And it was basically elaborately decorated nails of people holding baby animals. And then he researched into which models had a big following, and there was a new young model called Cara Delevingne who had something like 90,000 followers, which at that point was very sort of impressive. And so we did this really weird shoot with Cara Delevingne, and then and as kind of at that point I was fashion director of the site, and I was like, well, if we're doing it, let's do it properly. We'll do it as a photo shoot. And so, we dressed her in particular designers, and she wore fine jewelry, because I was like, oh well, if it's the hands, then fine jewelry will work. So it was different fine jewelers, different fashion houses, and she was holding different animals. She was holding like baby chicks, a little chihuahua, a cat, a kitten who absolutely hated. She was wearing Valentino gloves, and this kitten was looking so freaked out by these gloves, like claw. And there's all these pictures of her holding this cat that's literally like screaming. But again, that was something that Nick was kind of ahead of the curve with, and within
It was that
2 years' time,
fascination
everyone
for
was on it.
fascination for technology, for what's new and what's next, and how can fashion meet this new world of technology.
I also think the interesting thing with Nick and with Instagram and the iPhone, and he said this as well, is it's made him kind of rediscover a direct love of photography, because he takes the pictures himself. He doesn't need an assistant. He doesn't need a Hasselblad. He doesn't need loads of lighting. It's him. It's like the kind of floral studies that he does. They're incredibly direct images that he can control. And then, and he has a set of tools that he can, retouch with and alter the kind of exposure and things. So I think it's very interesting that with this kind of, and it's also that thing of when people say, oh, everyone can be a photographer now. And I'm like, no, because you look at what Nick's doing, and no one else is doing that, or not everyone else is doing that. You need this level of kind of skill, this aesthetic consideration, also this kind of determination, and this, the fact that Nick will spend 6 hours taking pictures on his iPhone of flowers. And also, I think there's something really nice and kind of egalitarian about it, that he's not like, he could have a Hasselblad, he could be doing it in an incredibly formal way in a studio, but it's not. It's kind of for the love of the art and for the love of the image, and that's something that I really learned from him. I think that there are people that are just incredibly passionate about creating things, and SHOWstudio has never been a thing about making money. I always used to say to people, Nick could have a yacht or a big fancy kind of, house on, on the French Riviera or something, but he doesn't. He has SHOWstudio. That's what he has as kind of his playground.
And supports creatives and kind of creates new generations of talent. Like with myself, again, he sharpened my skills like nothing else in my life. And speaking of Nick, the next image you chose was the Gaultier Couture
Yes.
AW14 for the Independent magazine.
Yeah. So this was when I became fashion editor of the Independent. The first person I asked to shoot for it was Nick, and was kind of like, I have no money, because the Independent, newspapers don't have money to do kind of big fashion shoots. And Nick asked how much I had, and I said, and we negotiated a little bit and tried to get, and we did a shoot before this, which was actually all on iPhone, and was of kind of powerful women on social media, which was, it's actually very much connected with that Instagram shoot that I talked about. But this was, again, I kind of went cap in hand to Nick and said, I'd really love you to do something. What will you do? And Nick will always shoot couture. Nick always wants to shoot couture. So he said, can we do couture? And this was actually my first time working with Amanda Harlock as well, who is an incredible dear friend and someone who I've admired. It's quite difficult in a way with Amanda, because she's someone I think who's really shaped me even earlier than Nick, because what she did with Galliano shaped me so much, as a kid, not even before I was a teenager. So, and someone who I always kind of precociously thought, oh, if we ever met each other, we'd really get along. And then we did meet each other, and we do really get along. And it's nice to find someone who does really share your viewpoint on fashion and the meaning of fashion. And, Amanda is such an amazing creative person and has such belief in what she does. And, she really doesn't want to do things that are meaningless. And I think that's something that I hope as well. So she's a total pleasure. And we did this kind of crazy shoot where she was interested in the idea of deconstructing couture, so the idea of choosing outfits and then choosing outfits that were kind of either the underwear of the outfits or looked like they could be the underwear of the outfits, and then being able to kind of deconstruct the look. And Nick pushed it a little bit further and had kind of a contortionist involved in wearing the outfits. So then, so again, kind of deconstructing the poses, because this person was able to do things with their body that you kind of shouldn't be able to do with your body. And yeah, so it was a big story that we did for the Independent magazine. And honestly, it probably wasn't best placed in the Independent. A lot of people said to me, this really should be running in, in a kind of style magazine or something. It's not the kind of thing that a newspaper would normally publish. Certainly not now. I think maybe in the 90s they did. But it's a story that I'm incredibly proud of. I think it's incredibly beautiful. And it was a lot of fun. It was kind of a crazy couple of days of shooting all of these incredible couture looks, and and there's some of the kind of most amazing clothes. And I love the Gaultier. There's a picture where the model's kind of throwing her foot up, and you get this like really amazing heel of a Manolo Blahnik pump, which I think is very it's kind of prime Amanda of choosing the perfect shoe for that moment. And also, interestingly, all the gold silk is actually recycled from that Charlize Theron J'adore advertising campaign that Nick had somehow kind of squirreled away, and then we got it out for this.
It's kind of fashion history meets more of fashion history together.
I mean, it's very weird to think that that's now 11 years old, and it, in a sense, is a historical relic, because it was Mathieu Blasi for Margiela, and it was Jean-Paul Gaultier for Jean-Paul Gaultier, and it was Carl for Chanel, and it was Raf for Dior. So it's a lot of kind of houses that now are very different. Maria Grazia and Pia Paolo for Valentino. It
feels like a different world.
I mean, it was a different world. But it was an amazing experience. And yeah, working with just, incredible creative people and doing something that was very purely just for the kind of love of creating something. There was no sort of commercial element to it. It's the most uncommercial thing you could do.
How was it for you moving from such a experimental space for so many years into, more of a more rigid media space where, you have the idea of advertisers, you have the idea of revenue, you have the idea of audiences, target audiences. How did you find that?
Well, I got that when I moved from SHOWstudio and went to work at Love with Katie Grand. Love was a Condé Nast title. So immediately you were interacting with people in a very different way, that there was kind of, there was advertising budgets, there were specials, but I actually found it very valuable, because at SHOWstudio, I didn't really interact with kind of marketing people or advertising people or a lot of PR people, honestly. Whereas at Love, it was quite, it was regimented. It was a job to go and speak to these people and ensure that they were happy with the magazine and to work with them on what we could do. And it ended up being, I think, very valuable, because it put me in contact with a lot of people that I'd never met before, and people who now are I'm very good friends with. But also, it's I think it's always been part of fashion. I think people think it's a very modern thing, but there's that whole, there's a story of Dinah Vreeland wanting to get rid of handbags from an issue of Harper's Bazaar and make it all about pockets. And someone said, do you know how much money we make from handbag advertising? This is never going to happen. So I think people think it's a very modern kind of post-80s thing of the kind of the door being kicked down between the creative and the advertising department, but I actually think it's a long-standing thing. And also, I think there's, to a degree, that story at the Independent, it's an amazing story. But I always think with some of these things, it's kind of easy to do an amazing story like that, because when you have the greatest clothes and and a great photographer and an amazing stylist, and if you have an incredible model as well, it's there's not so much challenge in doing that as there is with kind of working with a weak season of clothes and trying to do something that appeases advertisers and also does something creative. I think that's something that I find very interesting in fashion, is that thing where, you have to encapsulate a particular moment It sounds like a weird thing for someone who's very interested in vintage, but I almost feel, and I lend my clothes to people to shoot for magazine editorials and things, but sometimes I think it's a bit of a cop-out to shoot the greatest fashion of the past. It's like, no, you should be looking at what's going on around you and seeing what you can create with that. That's really amazing. And that's actually when you look at a lot of the really incredible imagery, it is from people that are reacting to the time. And maybe it's not the greatest clothes, but sometimes you can make kind of amazing imagery out of that.
Well, it's also this idea of, the subconscious bias. When you shoot a Galliano from the 90s, there's a part of you that will always revert back to the imagery that made you so inspired to want to shoot it in the first place.
Yeah.
And I think it's something you bring up a point that's really interesting about, magazines nowadays. And there's almost like this balance between how much can we reference the past and how much can we look out into the future, which brings me into the other image that you chose, which was Oliver Dahl's shop Balenciaga Couture. This is you in 2021 acting as the fashion director at another, which you still are. How is this different from all of those past experiences, and why did you choose this, Otto?
I chose that because it's very much tied in with an experience. It's not just an image, because I wasn't directly involved with the image. It's Marie Shea styled it. Ola Rindle photographed it. It was shot in Paris after the Balenciaga Couture show. But what the lead up to that image was, basically I spent 6 months with Demna in the lead up to his first Balenciaga Couture show. And Couture had been slated for 2020, and then obviously there was COVID. And so in 2021, actually still in lockdown, Balenciaga got in touch to say, look, we're doing this and we'd like to do something with you on it, which was amazing. And, it's obviously amazing that Another is kind of an incredible title that I love, and it gives both the opportunity to me as a journalist to do long form journalism, and also the opportunity to a fashion house, to a photographer, and to a stylist to do a big story. I think this story was 16, 20 pages of imagery, and there were a lot of words with it as well. And so then I went to Paris. I had to get like special dispensation. Balenciaga had to write me a letter to be allowed to travel. It was when there was still the curfew, so you couldn't go out after 7 p.m. And I was staying at the Hotel de Louvre. So literally looking out and seeing Paris completely deserted at 7 o'clock, which was very, very weird. And all the cafes were closed. It was a very, very strange experience.
Almost like an alternative reality.
And also the other weird thing was I was going to spend a day in the archives with Demna, but I had to spend a week quarantining in the Hotel de Louvre. And I couldn't eat meals with anybody. I think technically I wasn't supposed to go out during the day, but I did. And I kind of walked around Paris, but it was completely empty, and you couldn't get a cup of coffee. It was all closed. And then weirdly, the day that I went to the archive was the day that it was all lifted. So all of a sudden in the morning, all the cafes were open, and it was like normal Paris when it had been a ghost town for a whole week.
Beginning of a new world, basically.
Yeah, it was a very strange experience. And then we went to, I went to the archives, and I spent probably about 6 or 8 hours in the archives with Demna, and they'd brought some pieces of the current couture collection to the archive. So we were looking at those next to original archive pieces. And also the Balenciaga archives are amazing because they have everything. So they literally have there used to be an elevator in Balenciaga that's like Cordovan leather lined elevator, and they have the elevator. They have Balenciaga's collection of costume history books. They obviously have archival fashion and all of Demna's fashion and all of Nicolas, everything. But it was to spend that time kind of in the archives talking with Demna about what Balenciaga means and how he related to Cristobal Balenciaga and all of this. It was a really kind of exceptional experience. And then we also carried on kind of having a conversation via phone. So we had maybe 4 or 5 phone interviews as well. around this, which became very weird and sort of, he said they were like therapy. Like I'd phone him up and be like, so, how are you feeling? And then talking to him after the show. So it was just, it was very nice because I was given a lot of access to Demna. They were really open about it. I was, given a hell of a lot of access to Balenciaga as a house, access to him, and to be able to kind of chart this really sort of pivotal moment, because it was, it was the 50th couture collection. It felt to me like it was something incredibly significant. And I also love how, I think the images are beautiful. I love that particular image, the image from the cover, it's that orange suit, which was my favorite look from the collection, and it's photographed through a bus stop, through a bus shelter. So I love that it looks like this kind of Owen Blumenfeld sort of 50s couture thing, but then it's actually achieved through something incredibly modern. And I think it's a really good sort of,
it's a really good depiction of
what I mean, it's very much kind of
was.
Yeah. And I didn't choose it because of him moving to Gucci and everything. It was something that I was already thinking about, and then obviously all this stuff has happened recently. I'm like, oh yeah, prescient, an interesting thing. But it was a really extraordinary project, and I think it's one of the things that I love about Another is that it gives you the space to do those kind of things. It's very much, it's very generous with imagery, but also there's always a huge amount of words in Another. And I think the balance between those and these kind of intelligent expressions of fashion, and then also fashion's intersection with art, with culture, I think it is it's a magazine that's about kind of enriching fashion, but equally it's not about ignoring fashion. It's not about denigrating fashion and saying that other things are better than fashion. And fashion isn't a kind of poor relation to the art or to the culture in there. It just kind of all mixes together really well. It's why I think I feel very kind of at home there.
And how have you found the psychological element of your job? Because I think as fashion editors, as journalists, as people who speak to other people and try to get them to understand their art and their craft, I oftentimes feel very psychological. It's like that constant curiosity that I've always had about life and about people. How have you approached journalism in your career? Do you approach it through a psychological point of view, or do you like to be a bit more kind of fact-based?
I think I'm probably more fact-based than, but then again, I feel like a lot of what I've written has been kind of about opinion. I do think in the past I perhaps came across as much more opinionated than I am now. I think as you age, you tend to mellow out a little bit. I'm maybe not quite as angry about things as I used to be. But I think a lot of it is based on opinion and on. So there is a kind of stating of fact, but there's also this, this is my opinion. This is what I feel is important. This is what I feel is significant. I'm lucky that I get to, profile people that I think are important and whose opinions I'm interested in. And then, to kind of have that exchange with people who also are interested in my opinions. When it's someone like Azzedine Alaïa who's interested in what I've got to say, that was always a kind of pinch me moment, that I was sat at Azzedine's table talking about fashion and that he was listening and interested in what I have to say. And I think it's the same when I talk with Mrs. Prada or when I talk to Raf or anybody. I feel immensely privileged that I'm in a position where we can speak on a level to one another. And that, they're interested in what I think is going on in the industry and, my opinion about what's happening and changes and what they're doing. And it's, that's something that I'm very kind of pleased about. But I don't know if that kind of reflects a kind of psychology or anything. I think it's, I think a lot of the time it's about what's in front of your face, but then you can sometimes do the backtracking of what does that mean in a wider, socio-political aspect, which is also something I like when I'm, writing for something like the Financial Times, and also when I was writing for the Independent. It's interesting because you're writing you're communicating with people that don't particularly know a lot about fashion. And I think it's also about convincing them that what you're saying is of merit and of importance,
Yeah.
and also trying to communicate about something that they don't really know, and tell them a story in as concise a way as you possibly can. And that's, I've written for newspapers now for, I guess, just shy of 15 years, because I did, I wrote for The Independent, New York Times, Financial Times. And the interesting thing with all of them is, it's not a fashion audience.
And that can be oftentimes quite different in the way that you see what's important to them is oftentimes very different from what's important to the main fashion fanatic or the kind of fashion primary audience.
Well, I think sometimes it's interesting because you have to kind of unpack a lot of things. Like, I would assume everybody would know something that I'm writing about, but when you actually have to kind of backtrack and deconstruct it a little bit, that can become very interesting, because it also prompts you to ask additional questions about, where something comes from. Why is this way? Especially when there's lots of kind of received ideas within fashion, I think. Yeah. And yet, but I'm also surprised sometimes at the things that people kind of let me get away with. I wrote something about conspicuous leisure and Thorsten Veblen and all these kind of ideas of like 19th century dress, but projected into now, the idea of kind of clothes that impede movement and what the kind of psychology of that is. And the Financial Times absolutely loved it. It's one of the most like obscure things I've ever written, but it's, weirdly, the readers loved it. The editors loved it. Someone said they thought it was the best kind of unpacking of what Veblen's theory of the leisure class was, which was really nice for me to have someone who's not in fashion say that. And I always think I love writing for Another because I think it's very much a connoisseur's magazine, but I also equally love when someone who has no interest in fashion is interested in something that I've written. I always think there's something very nice about kind of, preaching to people that aren't, not preaching to the converted.
Yeah. Your last image is a Willy Vanderpoor image.
Yeah.
Prada SS24 for Another magazine.
Yeah.
What was your thought process behind ending on this image?
Well, again, that's kind of tied in with an experience, which was that Susanna Frankel, who's the editor-in-chief of Another, and we went to interview Raf and Mrs. Prada. So we had this thing where it was a four-way conversation between us, which was, a really extraordinary experience, and was actually the idea of Olivier Rizzo, who styled the image with Willy. And they have a long history with Another. And I wrote a thing for Willy's exhibition in Antwerp, and ended up writing something about the way that they approach imagery and how you end up, they start off with models who become friends, who become family. And I think you really get a sense of that in that image. And in some of the other images that they've produced for Another, we shot Raf's last collection with Julia Nobis, who flew herself to be in the story. So I think it's interesting that there is such kind of emotional weight behind it, certainly in terms of how long they've collaborated with Raf, and then actually how long they've collaborated with Mrs. Prada. But as an experience, going and doing that interview kind of with someone that I work incredibly closely with and I'm very good friends with, and then also Raf and Mrs. Prada obviously work incredibly closely together, it was something that felt very, very interesting. And the dynamic of I've never had that dynamic before, where essentially there are two interviewees and two interviewers, and you're all talking over one another and having kind of separate conversations. And it was a bit of a nightmare, but at the same time, everyone's saying very interesting things.
You want to catch all of it.
It was just a really, really interesting experience. And it's also one of the things that, one of the things I love about working for Another is that we do really unexpected things. Kind of, we work in unexpected ways where we really try and challenge ourselves. Susanna is someone that I've been incredibly close to for a long time. I actually met her my first season in Paris. I had dinner with her, and it was the first time I'd kind of met her. And my first commission outside of SHOWstudio was to write for The Independent when she was the fashion editor of The Independent. So we've had a very long kind of professional relationship together, but we're also very, very good friends. And so it's yes, and that's kind of an homage to my relationship with Susanna. I don't think I could have done that with many other people, possibly no other people, in terms of working alongside them like that, and then alongside her to, to devise the questions beforehand and then to edit the whole thing afterwards. But we work together incredibly well. We both respect each other a hell of a lot. I think she's an incredible journalist and a really amazing editor. Much better editor than I ever could be, because she is far more diplomatic than I am. And has a real vision. And again, she's, she is interested in culture, in art, in this kind of, in cinema, in music, in this 360-degree view. And I think you really get that in Another. There's really kind of her authorship in Another. And I feel very privileged to be part of it. So that's kind of why I chose that image. And also, it was a wonderful experience.
When you look back at such an illustrious career, and I can almost say that you chose this career for yourself when you were 12, from what you told me.
Yeah.
What do you see going back?
I've been very lucky. I've been in the right place at the right time in a lot of this. But I do think a thing that lots of people appreciate with me and like and react to is that it's what I love. I don't do it because I want to go to a party or I do want to go to fashion shows, but I don't want to go to fashion shows to be seen going to a fashion show. I'm going to a fashion show because I want to see it. Because I think being present for a live event is incredibly important. And it does, I've talked about it before, that it feels like a compulsion to go and see these things, because people will often, when I say I'm going to a show, people will be like, why are you going to this show? Like, why are you going to this bad show? Why are you going here? Why are you traveling all this way? And for me, it's like, I feel like you should see everything, especially if you want to have a judgment. And, and if you have the opportunity to, I think it's a real privilege that I get to go and see these things. But I think, what I hope from what people have said to me is that, people react to the fact that I love fashion. It was, to talk about Azadine again, I remember talking to him and him saying, he's like, well, you love fashion and I love fashion, and that's why we get along. Like, because you don't think something else is more important than fashion. You're in love with it. It's enough for you. And I think that's what it's actually why I think a lot of designers, I get along with a lot of designers, because I think, fashion's a really tough business. It's really tough to be a designer, and to succeed as a designer, you have to really love what you're doing if you're going to do it. And I think they recognize kind of a love, and connected with the love, a kind of knowledge of what they're doing, and also the realization that it is really hard. So I hope that's what people kind of take from my journalism and, from my general view on fashion, is that I have a real, it's what I've loved since I was a kid, and it's something that I've never kind of lost the love for.
Alexander Fury, thank you so much for being on Fashion Forensics.
Thank you.